A History of Role-Playing Games in 101 Objects, Chapter 8, OGL. In the last chapter, we covered the 1990s, and we finished by looking at the demise of several companies instrumental in the growth of the RPG industry, the most important of which, by far, of course, was TSR. TSR had got into trouble in the 90s and ended up going bankrupt and being bought out by Wizards of the Coast, flush with money from the success of Magic the Gathering. Wasn't long before Wizards of the Coast decided that they wanted their own new edition of Dungeons & Dragons. The existing editions of Dungeons & Dragons, I say editions here, have been out a while. Second edition AD&D and also various iterations of basic D&D. Wizards decided they would have a new system, tidy up a lot of the things that they saw as being wrong with AD&D, and also drop the distinction between basic and advanced. So what we got was 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. This confuses a lot of people. It's actually essentially 3rd edition advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but in the absence of basic, it just makes more sense to call everything Dungeons and Dragons now. So 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, all follow on from 2nd edition and 1st edition advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Original, basic, etc. is arguably a different product line. So 3rd edition, it was developed by Monty Cook, Jonathan Tweet and Skip Williams in the most part at Wizards of the Coast. Made some changes mechanically. Ascending armor class, and the fundamental point that a creature's armor class was what you needed to roll on a d20 to hit it, plus or minus everything else, but without having to worry about to hit armor class 0 scores or looking things up on tables in your player's handbook or Dungeon Master's screen. And that was a good idea. They liberalised classes and races such that any race could be any class, and there were no level limits if you were, not human. All that kind of thing. And it was very popular. It started off in the traditional way with a player's handbook, a Dungeon Master's guide, and a monster manual. In fact, I'll show you a Dungeon Master's guide. Actually, what I'll do is I'll show you a picture of a player's handbook, a 3rd edition player's handbook. I'm doing this because bizarrely at the moment we don't have any 3.0 PHBs, Dungeon Master's Guide, or monster manuals in stock. So here's a picture of a 3rd edition player's handbook. There's a later revision which is called version 3.5, and I do have a version 3.5 Dungeon Master's Guide to hand, but that came later and tweaked some rules, added things for balance. Incidentally, the version 3.5 one is, if you can play 3rd edition, go for 3.5. It's the one to get, and consequently is worth a bit more. What I would say though, that the most important thing about 3rd edition was not any of the rules changes. It was the open source nature of what Wizards of the Coast did with this. They allowed, completely unlike TSR's attitude, they allowed third-party publishers to produce material for Dungeons and Dragons. And in fact, they went so far as to create what was called a system resource document, which was basically the rules of Dungeons and Dragons, which was free, and they distributed it freely, and you could use anything in the system resource document for your own material. So you are free to use all the monsters, all player character classes, and so on in the SRD for your own third-party publisher, and you could sell them commercially. And in fact, I'll show you an example. I'll show you a copy actually of the open. You had to produce this open gaming license. You had to publish it in the back of any supplement that you produced. So here's what it looks like. Yeah, basically it's small text legalese. But the effect that this had on the industry, hugely profound. Because Dungeons and Dragons was still the most popular game out there. It had never been passed, even by the likes of World of Darkness. And all of a sudden, if you were a small, up-and-coming role-playing game company, you could publish stuff for the biggest role-playing game out there. And in fact, there was a big shot in the arm to where sales of second edition been flagging, third edition got people playing again. And a lot of companies sprung up to support third edition. So what I just showed you was the back of this supplement, Encyclopedia Arcane Demonology, The Dark Road. Fairly slimmish softback, not particularly notable in any way, just representative of the tons and tons of stuff which companies like, in this case, Mongoose Publishing, churned out. And there really were a lot of material. There was a lot of material coming from a lot of different companies for third edition. So if you played a particular class, there were probably 2 or 3 books out there that were just for that class. There would be lots and lots of books out there on particular types of magic. There would be whole new, they wouldn't be called monster manuals, but they're similar books, as well as whole new lots of campaign settings, lots of adventures. Just more. It's probably still the case, I would guess, that there's been more material produced commercially for third edition D&D than for any other role-playing game, and I suspect that it's not even close. Mongoose was one of the companies that started up like this. There were many others that became huge at this time, and also some of the other larger companies that were making money from other role-playing games took a bit of action. So White Wolf, obviously having a lot of success at the time with Vampire and Werewolf and all those games, decided it would have a line producing third edition D&D stuff, and it was called Sword and Sorcery. So my Object 68, I think we call the Player's Handbook. 69 is the Open Gaming License, and I'm going to show you this as Object 70 is representative of the kind of thing that you could get for third edition D&D. On top of that, people realised, well, you could use the Open Gaming License to create your own role-playing game, and it would use essentially D&D rules that everybody would know. So in the past, it might have been difficult persuading people to play a Conan role-playing game and having to learn a whole new set of rules. Whereas now, you could produce something like this, Conan the role-playing game, again by Mongoose, using the Open Gaming License, and the rule system was basically D&D. If I turn to, just a moment, if I turn to here, you can see we've got talking about abilities, strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, and you see that and you think, this is D&D, I know how to play this, great. Or you might think, this is close enough to D&D that I can take bits of this and use it in my own D&D campaign. And lots of people did that. So new role-playing games sprang up that used essentially D&D rules. And that just reinforced the dominant position of third edition D&D in the marketplace. And here's another one. This is Object 73. This is particularly beautiful. This is the original Game of Thrones role-playing game. Long before there was a TV series, there was a role-playing game. In fact, this is early enough that it came out after the first book, but before the second book. It came out before Clash of Kings. But if you've ever wanted to know what character class and level Tyrion Lannister is, you can have a look in there. This is the deluxe version, which is really, really nice. Sort of silver foil. And if I show you, sort of leather bound. It's leather. I think it's actually real leather. This one. And this is numbered 9812500. Really quite a rare item, this one. There's a more standard edition which we've also got in stock. At the time, Game of Thrones is not a major property. It was just a successful fantasy novel, and it meant that you could produce a really high quality role-playing game, but you wouldn't have to get people over that hump of having to learn a whole new rule system, because they knew D&D and they could quickly adapt to it. And in fact, that's so important that other major role-playing games begin to come out with D20 versions. D20 is what the rule system was called. So you can call it, you wouldn't call it Traveller Dungeons and Dragons, you'd call it Traveller D20. Fine. Here we go. That is Traveller D20. Traveller D20 is called Traveller 20. And there's a Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu D20. There's also, oh, I don't have it with me. There's a World of Darkness D20. It's actually called Monty Cook's World of Darkness, which I've always found a little bit strange, given that Monty Cook in no way invented the World of Darkness. That would be Mark Reinhagen. He just did the D20 conversion, so I'm not quite sure why he gets to call it Monty Cook's World of Darkness. So this is the impact this had on the industry can't be overstated. At one point, it seems like it would never again be possible for a major commercial role-playing game to be released with anything other than the D20 rule system. And I don't think that was a positive development, because although it was good, I don't think the D20 rule system was perfect, and I don't think it was necessarily the best for every kind of role-playing game. In particular, as you know, I'm a Traveller fan, and I don't think the D20 system works very well for Traveller at all. Although some of the adventures that came out for Traveller 20 and some of the supplements that came out for it are very good. But I don't particularly want to play Traveller with character classes, for example, and I don't think the D20 system handles automatic fire weapons very well. There are lots of other D20 systems, D20 system role-playing games, though I'm not going to go through them all. There were just a lot, and they easily covered most of the market, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, I suppose, for the sake of the industry. A lot of companies were able to cash in and make some money out of role-playing games because of the open gaming license, and that's good. Because in the 1990s, after Magic the Gathering came out and the bottom fell out of the industry, it didn't look like that was going to be possible again. So I think Wizards of the Coast, I think this is difficult, because I think Wizards of the Coast clearly did damage to the role-playing game industry through no fault of their own with the success of Magic the Gathering. But I think they also saved it to some extent, and I think the open gaming license was a wonderful thing. I'd say it was a shame that they went away from it, but they did go away from it. In fact, they did. Yes, they did go away from it. They never pulled it off. They never pulled the open gaming license, so it's still out there. You can still produce and sell things using the open gaming license. But what they did was they developed new versions of Dungeons and Dragons without the open gaming license, and we'll come to that in the next chapter. There's one more thing I want to go through in this chapter, though, quite quickly. This will be Object 76, because another development that comes out of the open gaming license is the old school Renaissance. A number of people had been, I suppose, disappointed with the direction that Dungeons and Dragons in particular was taking towards rather more epic storytelling, if you like, and away from old-fashioned dungeon crawls and the sort of adventures that were typically around in the late 70s, early 80s. It's tempting to call this first edition type adventures, but Dragonlance was first edition, and that's not what we're talking about. Dragonlance, I suppose, is closer to a modern setting, a modern kind of campaign. The sort of thing I'm talking about is going into a dungeon, hitting the monsters hard, nicking their treasure, and rinse and repeat. And so a number of people produced role-playing games using the open gaming license that were essentially rewrites of earlier versions of Dungeons and Dragons. Here's a classic example. This is Osric, old school reference and index compilation. This is, broadly speaking, of using the open gaming license to produce a role-playing game that's rather like first edition AD&D. There are many other old school Renaissance role-playing games, or old school retro clones, as they're sometimes called, which take the open gaming license and use it to produce games that are reminiscent of different versions of D&D. So original White Box, Brown Box, or Holmes Basic, or Moldave BX, or BECMI Rules Compendium, or etc. etc. I think they're great. We sell a lot of old school stuff. Those are the earlier versions, and the earlier versions were never perhaps that commercial and tended to be sold rather more through online or to be distributed quite cheaply. But more commercial manifestations of the old school Renaissance appeared. Castles and Crusades would be an excellent example. Probably the biggest one at the moment is Dungeon Crawl Classics, which I think actually introduces some of its own innovations. It'd be difficult to call Dungeon Crawl Classics a retro clone, because it's rather more of its own system, although on the shop website we certainly put it under the old school retro clones subcategory. And Lamentations of the Flame Princess would be another technically a retro clone, but does something very different with AD&D type rules. All worth checking out if you want to do something that's a bit different from the sometimes wishy-washy modern D&D setting. I call this chapter OGL because that, to me, is a more important event in the history of role-playing games than the release of 3rd edition. It was the particular availability of open gaming license, allowing companies to produce their own material that used the Dungeons and Dragons rule set. Now, like I said, that's going to change, and we'll cover that in the next chapter.